The howling wind of December 1879 rattled the shutters of Florence Roberts' modest cabin as she huddled beneath a threadbare quilt, watching her last log crumble to embers in the fireplace. 3 days of relentless snow had transformed Dalhart, Texas, into a frozen wasteland, isolating her completely from the town where she'd only arrived 2 months prior to take up a position as the local schoolteacher. The brutal winter had caught everyone by surprise, but Florence, most of all a Kentucky-born woman of 22 who had never experienced such merciless cold. Florence stared at the dying fire with growing desperation. The wood supply she'd purchased from the general store had seemed ample for her first winter, but that was before the blizzard. Now, with temperatures plummeting and snow drifts piling against her door, the reality of her situation became clear. Without more firewood, she wouldn't survive the night. With trembling hands, she pulled on every layer of clothing she owned: 2 dresses, a shawl, her heaviest woolen stockings, and the sturdy boots she'd purchased specifically for Texas life. The leather gloves she tugged over her slender fingers were hardly adequate for the biting cold, but they were all she had. "You can do this, Florence," she whispered to herself as she wrapped a scarf around her face, leaving only her hazel eyes exposed. "Just to the woodshed and back, that's all." The moment she opened her door, the wind nearly knocked her backward. Snow swirled into her cabin, and Florence had to throw her weight against the door to close it behind her. The path to her small woodshed, a mere 20 yards from her cabin, had completely disappeared beneath 3 feet of snow. Each step was a battle as she waded through the drifts, the cold seeping through her layers despite her efforts. When Florence finally reached the woodshed, her heart sank. The door hung open, swinging violently in the wind, and the modest pile of logs she'd stored there was gone. Every last piece. Her mind reeled with confusion. Who would steal firewood during a blizzard? And how had she not heard them? A movement in the corner of the shed caught her attention. Huddled against the wall, partially hidden behind an empty barrel, was a figure. Florence's first instinct was to run, but the cold had made her desperate and anger flared inside her. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "That was my wood. I needed to survive." The figure shifted and Florence gasped as a woman emerged from the shadows. She was thin painfully, so with hollow cheeks and dark circles beneath blue eyes that held both fear and defiance. Her clothes were tattered and far too thin for the weather, her lips blue with cold. She couldn't have been more than 18 or 19. "I'm sorry," the young woman said, her voice barely audible. "I was so cold, I just needed to warm up." Florence's anger wavered. The girl was clearly starving and half frozen. "Where did you take my wood?" she asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. The girl pointed with a shaking hand toward the tree line beyond Florence's property. "There's a camp. I brought it there. Please, I didn't know it would leave you with nothing." Florence hesitated, torn between compassion and self-preservation. "Show me," she finally said. "I need at least some of it back, or I'll freeze to death too." Together they struggled through the snow, the younger woman leading Florence toward a small copse of pine trees that provided minimal shelter from the wind. As they approached, Florence saw a makeshift tent constructed from a wagon canvas stretched between the trees. Smoke curled from a small fire at its entrance, and beside it stood a man who straightened as he spotted them. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a weathered face partially hidden beneath a thick beard. A cowboy hat was pulled low over his eyes, but Florence could see his expression harden as the young woman approached with her in tow. "Maggie, who's this?" He called over the wind, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "She's the owner of the wood," the girl Maggie replied, her head bowed. I stole it from her shed. The man's eyes swept over Florence, taking in her relatively better clothing and the determination in her stance. For a moment, no one spoke as the wind whipped around them. Then, to Florence's surprise, his expression softened. He turned to the younger woman and gestured toward the tent. "Bring her in, Maggie. She's hungry too, I reckon, and half frozen by the looks of it." "But Patrick," Maggie began. "Bring her in," he repeated firmly. "We don't let folks freeze to death, even if they've come to take back what's rightfully theirs." Florence hesitated, studying the man Patrick with uncertainty. He seemed to read her thoughts. "Madam, I don't mean you any harm. The name's Patrick Callahan." "That's my sister Maggie. We're just trying to make it through this storm, same as you." He gestured to the tent. "It ain't much, but it's warmer than standing out here. We can talk about the wood inside." Something in his direct gaze convinced her. With a nod, Florence followed Maggie toward the tent, Patrick falling in behind them. The makeshift shelter was indeed warmer than outside, though calling it comfortable would have been a vast exaggeration. Her stolen firewood burned in a small pit at the center, with rocks arranged around it to contain the flames. The smoke escaped through a hole at the top of the tent, though not all of it made it out. "Sit, please," Patrick said, indicating a bedroll near the fire. As Florence settled down, she noticed their meager provisions: a small sack of beans, a coffee pot, and not much else. Their horses, two of them, were tethered at the back of the tent, providing additional warmth with their bodies. "I apologize for my sister," Patrick said as he fed her log into the fire. "We've been traveling north from San Antonio. Got caught in the storm 3 days ago." "Where are you headed?" Florence asked, unable to help herself. The warmth of the fire was beginning to thaw her frozen limbs, and with it, her capacity for curiosity returned. "Montana Territory," he replied. "Got word of ranching work up there." Maggie had busied herself with the coffee pot, avoiding Florence's eyes. The girl's hands shook as she worked, and Florence noticed dark bruises on her wrists. "You're a long way from Montana," Florence observed, "and this is a terrible time of year to be traveling north." Patrick's expression darkened. "Didn't have much choice in the timing. Had to leave San Antonio in a hurry." The way he said it made Florence suspect there was more to their story than a simple search for work, but she knew better than to pry. People came west for all sorts of reasons, many of them running from something or someone. "I'm Florence Roberts," she offered instead. "The new school teacher in Dalhart. I haven't been here long myself." Patrick nodded, studying her with renewed interest. "A school teacher. We need more of those out here." He hesitated, then added, "Look, Miss Roberts, I understand you want your wood back, and you've every right to it. But we can't give it all back and survive the night." Florence sighed, looking at the small fire and then at Maggie, who seemed to be fighting to stay on her feet. "I don't suppose any of us will survive if we don't work together," she conceded. "I have a cabin. It's small, but it's sturdy. You and your sister are welcome to wait out the storm there." Surprise flickered across Patrick's face. "That's mighty generous of a woman whose wood we stole." "Well, Mr. Callahan, I don't see many options. I need the wood, you need shelter, and none of us wants to die in this blizzard." She glanced at Maggie again. "Besides, your sister needs real food and rest. She looks half-starved." Patrick's expression softened as he followed her gaze. "She is. We both are, truth be told. Haven't had a proper meal in days." "I have provisions," Florence said. "Not a feast, but beans, some bacon, flour for biscuits. It will be enough until the storm passes." For a long moment, Patrick seemed to war with himself, pride battling necessity. Finally, he nodded. "We accept your offer, Miss Roberts, and we'll repay your kindness when we're able." Within the hour, they had packed up the makeshift camp. Patrick insisted on carrying the remaining firewood while Florence helped Maggie onto one of the horses. The younger woman was weaker than she'd let on, and Florence worried she might not have survived another night in the tent. The trek back to Florence's cabin was arduous. The snow had continued to fall, and the wind drove icy particles against their faces like tiny needles. By the time they reached the cabin door, all three were exhausted and thoroughly chilled. Inside, Florence quickly set about rebuilding the fire while Patrick brought in the wood. Maggie collapsed into Florence's rocking chair, her face alarmingly pale. "When did you two last eat?" Florence asked as she put a kettle on for tea. "Finished the last of our jerky yesterday morning," Patrick admitted, removing his snow-covered coat and hat. Without them, Florence could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly and eyes the color of aged whiskey. "That won't do at all," Florence murmured, already pulling out her precious food stores. "I'll make something straight away." While Patrick tended to the horses, securing them in the lean-to attached to her cabin, Florence prepared a simple but hearty stew with beans, bacon, and the few preserved vegetables she had left. The cabin slowly warmed as the fire blazed in the hearth, and the aroma of cooking food filled the small space. Maggie had fallen asleep in the chair, her breathing shallow. When Florence approached to cover her with a blanket, she noticed the girl was burning with fever. "Mr. Callahan," she called softly when Patrick returned, "your sister is ill." His face lined with worry, Patrick crossed to Maggie's side, placing a calloused hand on her forehead. "Damn it," he muttered. "She said she was just tired. Stubborn girl never complains even when she should." "Help me move her to the bed," Florence instructed, already pulling back the covers of her small bed in the corner. "She needs rest, warmth, and food in that order." Together they settled Maggie in Florence's bed. The girl barely stirred, which only heightened their concern. Florence fetched a cloth and basin of water to cool Maggie's forehead while Patrick hovered anxiously nearby. "She's always been delicate," he said quietly, "ever since we were kids, but she's tougher than she looks." Florence nodded. "I can see that." "She'd have to be to survive what you've been through." She looked up at him. "You don't have to tell me what you're running from, Mr. Callahan, but I should know if there's trouble following you to my door." Patrick stiffened, then slowly exhaled. "No law after us, if that's your concern." "Just a powerful man who believes he owns my sister." His jaw tightened. "Maggie was working as a maid in his house. He took liberties when I found out. I did what any brother would do." "You killed him?" Florence asked, her voice hushed. Patrick shook his head. "Wanted to. But no, I just broke his jaw and a few ribs. Took Maggie and left that night. Problem is, he's the type of man who doesn't like being defied. Has connections all over Texas. So we're heading north far as we can get." Florence absorbed this information, feeling a mixture of relief and concern. "I understand," she said simply, "and I don't blame you for protecting your sister." "I appreciate that, Miss Roberts." He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted. "I don't know how to thank you for taking us in. Most folks would have run us off their property or worse." "I was raised to help those in need," Florence replied, rising to check on the stew. "Besides, I haven't been in Dalhart long enough to know if that's wise or foolish out here." A ghost of a smile touched Patrick's lips. "Bit of both, probably. The West can be cruel, but I've also seen extraordinary kindness from strangers." He glanced at his sleeping sister. "She's all I've got left in this world. I couldn't let her stay there, no matter the consequences." Florence nodded, understanding all too well what it meant to protect the ones you loved. She had left everything familiar behind in Kentucky after her parents died, hoping to forge a new life where memories didn't haunt every corner. Teaching had been her salvation, a way to support herself while contributing something meaningful to the world. "The stew is ready," she said, changing the subject. "You should eat while it's hot. I'll try to wake Maggie for a few bites." They ate in relative silence, Patrick demolishing 2 bowls of the simple stew with the hunger of a man who hadn't seen a proper meal in days. Maggie managed only a few spoonfuls before drifting back to sleep, but Florence counted that as a victory nonetheless. As night deepened, the blizzard outside intensified. The wind screamed around the corners of the cabin, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. The fire crackled in response, holding back the worst of the cold. "You should take the chair," Florence told Patrick, arranging blankets on the floor near the hearth. "I'll sleep here by the fire." Patrick frowned. "I can't take your chair, Miss Roberts. The floor is fine for me." "You're too tall for the floor," she insisted. "You'd be cramped and miserable by morning. Please, I insist." After further protest, Patrick reluctantly agreed, though Florence noticed he waited until she had settled on her makeshift bed before removing his boots and stretching his long frame across the rocking chair, and a kitchen chair she'd placed as an extension. "Good night, Mr. Callahan," Florence said, pulling her blankets up to her chin. "Good night, Miss Roberts," he replied, his deep voice already heavy with impending sleep. "And thank you again." Florence lay awake for some time, listening to the storm and the soft breathing of her unexpected guests. The day had taken an extraordinary turn, from the fear of freezing to death alone to sharing her small cabin with 2 strangers running from a dangerous past. Yet somehow, despite the rational concerns she should have, she felt safer than she had since arriving in Dalhart. Perhaps, she thought as she drifted toward sleep, it was simply the comfort of not being alone during the storm. Or perhaps it was something about Patrick Callahan's protective nature that made her feel, for the first time in a very long while, that someone else might look out for her too. Morning came with blinding brightness, as sunlight reflected off the pristine snow. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of smooth white drifts and crystal-laden trees. Florence woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet murmur of voices. Patrick stood by the stove, brewing coffee in her small pot, while Maggie sat up in bed, still pale but notably more alert than the previous day. They both turned as Florence stirred from her blankets. "Good morning, Miss Roberts," Maggie said, her voice soft but stronger. "I hope we didn't wake you." "Not at all," Florence assured her, running a hand through her tangled auburn hair. "I'm glad to see you're feeling better." Patrick brought Florence a steaming cup of coffee. "Hope you don't mind. Thought you might appreciate this after sleeping on the floor." "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup gratefully. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Florence felt a surprising warmth spread up her arm at the brief contact. Patrick seemed to feel it too, his eyes lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to the stove. "I've been thinking," he said, his back to her as he stirred something in a pan eggs. Florence realized with surprise. She hadn't known she had any left. "Once the snow melts enough for travel, we should head into town. Maggie needs to see a doctor and we need to replenish your supplies that we've used." Florence sipped her coffee, considering his words. "The doctor in Dalhart is a good man, but—" She hesitated, unsure how to phrase her concern. Patrick turned, reading her expression. "You're worried about us being seen with you, about your reputation." "Not exactly," Florence clarified, though the thought had crossed her mind. A single woman hosting a man overnight, regardless of the circumstances, could indeed cause talk. "I'm more concerned about someone recognizing you if you're trying to stay hidden." Patrick's expression softened. "Always thinking of others, aren't you, Miss Roberts? Dalhart is far enough from San Antonio that I doubt anyone would know us. But if you prefer, Maggie and I can make our own way once the snow clears." "No," Florence said quickly, perhaps too quickly, based on the slight raise of Patrick's eyebrow. "That is, there's no rush. Maggie should rest until she's stronger, and the roads won't be passable for days yet." A small smile played at the corners of Patrick's mouth. "If you're sure." "I am," Florence replied firmly, rising to her feet. "Now let me help with breakfast." The next few days fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. The snow began to melt under the Texas sun, turning the drifts into treacherous slush by day that refroze into ice by night. Patrick spent hours chopping additional firewood from the trees near Florence's property, ensuring they would have enough to last until true spring arrived. Maggie recovered slowly but steadily. Her fever broke on the second day, and by the third, she was well enough to sit at the table and help Florence mend clothes and prepare meals. During these quiet hours, Florence learned more about the Callahan siblings. They had grown up on a small farm outside Dallas, the children of Irish immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life. Their parents had died of influenza when Patrick was 17 and Maggie just 10. With no other family, Patrick had done everything he could to keep them together, working ranch jobs while Maggie stayed with various families who took pity on the orphaned girl. When Maggie turned 16, she had insisted on working to contribute, which had led her to the position in the San Antonio household and ultimately to their current situation. "Patrick gave up everything for me," Maggie told Florence one afternoon, as they kneaded bread dough side by side. "He could have gone to California years ago, made something of himself. Instead, he stayed in Texas, always close enough to check on me." Florence glanced through the window to where Patrick was repairing a loose board on her lean-to, his strong hands working confidently with hammer and nails. "He loves you very much, that's clear to see." Maggie followed her gaze, a knowing smile touching her lips. "He deserves someone who cares for him the way he cares for others." She studied Florence's face. "Someone like you, perhaps?" Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Callahan and I barely know each other, Maggie." "Sometimes you don't need much time to know," Maggie replied sagely. "I see how he looks at you when you're not watching, and how you look at him." Florence busied herself with the dough, unwilling to admit even to herself how often her thoughts had turned to Patrick Callahan over the past days. His quiet strength, his gentle way with his sister, his surprisingly dry sense of humor that emerged more frequently as they grew comfortable with one another. These were dangerous thoughts for a schoolteacher in a small town to entertain about a man passing through. "We both know your brother won't be staying in Dalhart," Florence said finally. "He has plans to reach Montana, and I have my position here." Maggie shrugged, undeterred. "Plans change. Life happens while we're making other arrangements." She coughed suddenly, a deep, rattling sound that concerned Florence immediately. "Are you all right?" Florence asked, reaching for Maggie's arm. The younger woman nodded, though her face had gone pale again. "Just a bit tired. The bread can wait, can't it?" "Of course," Florence assured her, helping Maggie back to the bed. "Rest now. I'll finish up." But Maggie's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next few hours. By evening, her fever had returned with alarming intensity, and her breathing had become labored and wheezing. Patrick paced the small cabin, his face etched with worry. "We need to get her to the doctor," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Tonight." Florence looked out the window at the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping again, and the melted snow would be turning to ice. "The road to town will be treacherous in the dark." "I don't care," Patrick said firmly. "She needs help beyond what we can give her here. I've seen consumption take hold like this before. Every hour matters. The fear in his voice convinced Florence. All right, let me get my things. Patrick looked at her in surprise. You don't have to come, Miss Roberts. I can find the doctor myself. And leave me to worry all night. No, thank you, Florence replied, already pulling on her warmest clothes. Besides, you'll need help with Maggie, and I know where the doctor lives. They bundled Maggie in every blanket Florence owned and secured her on Patrick's strongest horse, with him mounting behind to hold her steady. Florence took the other horse, leading the way with a lantern held high to illuminate the dangerous path. The journey to Dalhart was slow and nerve-wracking. Twice, Florence's horse nearly lost its footing on the icy ground. Each time, Patrick called out instructions that helped her regain control. Maggie drifted in and out of consciousness, her head lolling against her brother's chest as they rode. The town was quiet when they arrived, most windows dark except for the saloon, which glowed with light, and the muffled sounds of piano music. Florence led them directly to a modest house on the eastern edge of town, where Dr. Henry Miller lived with his wife. The doctor answered their urgent knocking in his nightshirt, but transformed instantly into a professional when he saw Maggie's condition. He ushered them inside, calling to his wife to prepare the examination room at the back of the house. How long has she been like this, doctor? Miller asked as they carried Maggie to a narrow bed. The fever started 4 days ago, Patrick explained, his voice tight with worry. She seemed to be improving, but tonight. Pneumonia, most likely, the doctor muttered, already listening to Maggie's chest with his stethoscope. Possibly complicated by exhaustion and malnutrition. He glanced up at Patrick. She's very weak. The next 24 hours will be critical. Patrick's face drained of color, but he nodded resolutely. What can we do? You can start by telling me who you are, came a deep voice from the doorway. Florence turned to see Sheriff Thomas Wilson standing there, his hand resting casually on his holstered revolver. Got word from the telegraph office today about a man and woman matching your descriptions. Seems some folks in San Antonio are mighty interested in finding you. Patrick stiffened, instinctively moving to stand between the sheriff and his sister. My sister is ill. Whatever business you think you have with us can wait until she's better. Sheriff Wilson's expression remained impassive. That depends on what you're running from, son. The wire mentioned assault on a prominent citizen. Sheriff Wilson, Florence interjected, stepping forward. These people have been staying with me during the blizzard. Mr. Callahan saved my life when I was about to run out of firewood. Whatever happened in San Antonio, I can assure you they mean no harm to anyone in Dalhart. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. Miss Roberts, didn't expect to see our schoolteacher mixed up in this. His gaze shifted between Florence and Patrick, assessing. Doctor, how bad off is the girl, doctor? Miller looked up from administering medicine to Maggie. Critical, Sheriff. Moving her now would likely kill her. Sheriff Wilson sighed, his hand dropping from his revolver. All right. They can stay until she's stable, but I'll need the full story and I'll need to send a response to San Antonio. He fixed Patrick with a stern look. No running, understand. That'll just make things worse for both of you. Patrick nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly with relief. Thank you, Sheriff. I'll tell you everything tomorrow, just please let me stay with my sister tonight. The sheriff agreed, though he stationed a deputy outside the doctor's house as a precaution. Florence insisted on staying as well, despite Dr. Miller's assurance that his wife could help with Maggie's care. I'd feel better being here, she told Patrick quietly as they settled into chairs beside Maggie's bed. For both of you. Patrick reached across the unconscious form of his sister and took Florence's hand. I don't know what we would have done without you, Florence. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "You would have managed," she replied, though she didn't pull her hand away. "You're clearly a survivor, Patrick Callahan." A sad smile crossed his face. "Sometimes surviving isn't enough." He looked down at Maggie's pale face. "Sometimes I wonder if I've done right by her, keeping us on the move all these years. Maybe she would have been better off if I'd found her a proper home, a family." "She has a family," Florence said firmly. "She has you. And from what she's told me, there isn't anyone in the world she trusts more." They sat in silence for some time, hands still joined across Maggie's bed, each lost in their own thoughts as they watched the rise and fall of the young woman's chest. "I should tell you what happened," Patrick said eventually, his voice low, "before you hear it from the sheriff or someone else." Florence squeezed his hand. "Only if you want to." Patrick took a deep breath. The man Maggie worked for in San Antonio was Judge William Harrington. Respected citizen, pillar of the community. His voice hardened. Also a man who preyed on the young women who worked in his house. Maggie wasn't the first. Florence felt sick at the implication. "She told me you protected her." Patrick nodded grimly. "I visited her on her afternoon off every Sunday. One week she didn't show up at our meeting place. I went to the house, found her locked in a storage room, bruised and—" He swallowed hard. "She said it wasn't the first time. That he'd threatened to have me arrested on false charges if she ever told anyone." Florence's free hand covered her mouth in horror. "I confronted him in his study," Patrick continued. "Told him I was taking Maggie and that if he ever came near her again, I'd kill him." He laughed. "Said no one would believe a ranch hand over a judge." Patrick's jaw tightened. "That's when I hit him. Kept hitting him until he stopped moving. Thought I might have killed him, but Maggie pulled me off him. We grabbed what we could and ran." "You did what any brother would do," Florence said softly. "What any decent person would do." Patrick looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and doubt. "Maybe. But now Maggie's paying the price for my temper, if she dies because I dragged her across Texas in winter." "She won't die," Florence said with more confidence than she felt. "Maggie is stronger than she looks, remember? You said so yourself." The night stretched on endlessly. Dr. Miller checked on Maggie hourly, administering medicines and mustard plasters to ease her congested lungs. By dawn, her fever had broken, and her breathing, while still labored, had improved enough for the doctor to cautiously declare her out of immediate danger. Sheriff Wilson returned at mid-morning, as promised. Patrick repeated his story, this time with Florence and Dr. Miller present as witnesses. The sheriff listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Judge Harrington is claiming you attacked him unprovoked," he finally said. "Says you were drunk, demanding money from your sister that she didn't have." Patrick's face flushed with anger. "That's a damn lie." "Maybe so," the sheriff agreed mildly. "But it's his word against yours, and he's a judge with connections all the way to the governor's office." "What about Maggie's word?" Florence asked. "Surely her testimony counts for something." Sheriff Wilson sighed. "In theory, yes. In practice, a young woman accusing a powerful man of impropriety rarely ends well for the woman." He studied Patrick thoughtfully. "How far were you planning to run?" "Montana," Patrick admitted. "I have a friend there who offered work on his ranch." The sheriff nodded, as if coming to a decision. "Here's what I'm going to do. I'm sending a wire to San Antonio saying you passed through Dalhart heading west toward New Mexico territory. That should buy you some time." Patrick stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you help us?" Sheriff Wilson's gaze hardened. "Because I've had my suspicions about Judge Harrington for years. You're not the first to make such claims, just the first to do something about it." He stood up, adjusting his hat. "Once your sister is well enough to travel, I suggest you continue north as planned." And Mr. Callahan, next time, try to break fewer bones when defending your sister's honor. Makes my job easier." With that, the sheriff departed, leaving Patrick, Florence, and Dr. Miller in stunned silence. "Well, Dr. Miller said after a moment, "I believe Maggie will need at least 2 weeks of rest before she's strong enough for further travel. Perhaps longer." Patrick rubbed his face, overwhelmed by the reprieve they'd been granted. "I don't know how to thank you both." "You can start by getting some rest yourself," the doctor advised. "Mrs. Miller has prepared the spare room for you and Miss Roberts. I suggest you use it." Florence started to protest that they needn't share a room, but exhaustion overcame propriety. She had been awake for over 24 hours, and the emotional strain had left her drained. The spare room contained 2 small beds, and she was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. When she woke, late afternoon light was filtering through the curtains. Patrick sat on the edge of the other bed, watching her with a gentle expression that made her heart skip. "You talk in your sleep," he said softly. "Did you know that?" Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. "What did I say?" A smile tugged at his lips. "My name mostly." "Oh." She sat up, smoothing her rumpled dress self-consciously. "How is Maggie?" "Better," Patrick said, his relief evident. "Dr. Miller says the worst has passed. She's awake and asking for you, actually." Florence followed Patrick to Maggie's room, where the young woman was propped up on pillows, her face still pale but her eyes clear and alert. "Florence," Maggie greeted her with a weak smile. "The doctor says you helped save my life." "Hardly," Florence demurred. "I just helped get you to someone who could actually help." "Don't let her fool you," Patrick said, his voice warm with admiration. "She rode through freezing darkness and then stood up to the sheriff on our behalf. She's quite the heroine." Florence brushed aside his praise, though it warmed her more than she cared to admit. "How are you feeling, Maggie?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," the girl admitted. "But Dr. Miller says I'll recover fully with rest." She looked between Florence and her brother, a knowing glint in her eye despite her weakness. "He also says I shouldn't travel for at least 2 weeks." "That's right," Dr. Miller confirmed, entering the room with a tray of medicine. "And I've arranged for you to stay with us during your recovery. Mrs. Miller is delighted to have company, and it will be easier for me to monitor your progress." "That's very kind," Patrick began. "But we couldn't impose it's already decided," the doctor interrupted cheerfully. "Besides, it will look less suspicious to have Miss Roberts return to her cabin alone. People might wonder why she's hosting an unmarried man during his sister's convalescence." Florence hadn't considered the potential damage to her reputation if Patrick stayed with her without Maggie present. As the town's schoolteacher, she was held to a higher standard than most, and whispers of impropriety could cost her position. "The doctor is right," she acknowledged reluctantly. "My students return from the winter break next week, and I need to prepare." Patrick's expression fell slightly, but he nodded in understanding. "Of course. Your career is important." Mrs. Miller appeared with an offer to take Florence home in their wagon, as darkness was falling again and the roads remained treacherous. Before leaving, Florence promised to visit Maggie daily and squeezed the younger woman's hand. When she turned to say goodbye to Patrick, he asked to walk her to the wagon. Outside, in the privacy of the Miller's small garden, he stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Florence," he said softly, his eyes searching hers in the fading light, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." "There's no need," she assured him, acutely aware of his hand still resting on her arm, the warmth of it seeping through her sleeve. "There is," he insisted. "You took in 2 strangers who stole from you. You risked your reputation and possibly your safety. You helped save my sister's life." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. You've shown me more kindness in a few days than most people have in my entire life." Florence's breath caught as he raised a hand to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Anyone would have done the same," she whispered, though they both knew that wasn't true. "Not anyone," he contradicted softly. "Just you." His gaze dropped to her lips, and for a breathless moment, Florence thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, his hand falling away. "I should let you go. Mrs. Miller is waiting." Disappointment fluttered in Florence's chest, but she nodded and moved toward the waiting wagon. Before climbing in, she turned back to find Patrick watching her intently. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked, hating how hopeful she sounded. A smile warmed his face. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." True to his word, Patrick appeared at Florence's cabin the next morning, arms laden with firewood. "Thought you might need restocking," he explained with a sheepish grin. Florence welcomed him inside, grateful not just for the wood but for his company. They spent the day repairing small things around her property that had been damaged by the storm: loose boards, a broken window shutter, the chicken coop that had partially collapsed under the weight of snow. "You're quite handy," Florence observed as Patrick fixed her rocking chair, which had developed an alarming wobble. "Grew up on a farm," he reminded her, testing the chair's stability. "You learn to fix things yourself or do without. Is that what you'll do in Montana? Farm?" Patrick looked thoughtful. "No, ranching mostly. Cattle, I hope. I've always had a way with horses and livestock." He glanced at her. "What about you?" "Always wanted to be a teacher," Florence smiled, remembering her childhood dreams. "Actually, I wanted to be a writer. Novels, specifically. But after my parents died, I needed practical work. Teaching was the respectable option for a woman alone." "You still write, sometimes," she admitted. "Little stories, mostly. Nothing worthy of publication." "I'd like to read them someday," Patrick said, his sincerity evident. The day passed in comfortable conversation and shared work. Florence prepared a simple dinner and they ate together at her small table, talking about everything and nothing: books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they still harbored. As evening approached, Patrick reluctantly rose to leave. "I should get back to check on Maggie." Florence nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course, please give her my best." At the door, Patrick hesitated. "Florence, I've been thinking about what happens after Maggie recovers." Her heart quickened. "Oh. Montana is a long way," he said carefully, "and while I still think it's our best option for a fresh start." He trailed off, searching for words. "Yes," Florence prompted gently. Patrick took a deep breath. "I know we've only known each other a short time, but I feel. I mean, I've never met anyone quite like you." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "What I'm trying to say badly is that I don't want to leave you behind." Florence stared at him, her mind racing with implications. "Patrick, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I think I'm falling in love with you," he confessed in a rush. "And I'm asking if you might consider coming with us to Montana. Once Maggie is well enough to travel." The words hung in the air between them, monumental and transformative. Florence felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "I have a position here," she said weakly, grasping for practical concerns as her heart soared with unexpected joy. "Students who depend on me." "I know," Patrick acknowledged, "and I wouldn't ask you to abandon them mid-term. But perhaps when the school year ends." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I'm not offering much. The journey will be hard and I can't promise wealth or comfort, but I can promise to care for you, to build a life with you if you'll have me." Florence looked into his eyes and saw everything she'd never dared hope for: respect, admiration, tenderness, and yes, love, growing stronger each day. She had come west seeking a new beginning, never expecting it would arrive in the form of a man who'd stolen her firewood out of desperation. "The school term ends in May," she said softly. "That's 3 months away." Hope bloomed in Patrick's expression. "Is that a yes?" "It's a court me properly until then, and we'll see," Florence replied with a smile that belied her cautious words. Patrick's answering grin was radiant. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Florence responded with a certainty that surprised them both, her arms slipping around his neck as the kiss deepened into something warm and promising. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Patrick rested his forehead against hers. "I'll court you so properly the whole town will talk of nothing else," he vowed. And he did. Over the next 3 months, as winter mellowed into spring, Patrick Callahan became a fixture in Dalhart. With Maggie's recovery progressing well, he took odd jobs around town repairing fences, breaking horses at the livery stable, even helping the blacksmith when orders were heavy. He earned a reputation as a hard worker and an honest man, and gradually, the suspicions that had greeted his arrival faded. Every Sunday after church, he escorted Florence and Maggie, once she was well enough, on proper walks through town. He brought Florence wildflowers when they began to bloom, and carved her small wooden animals, a skill he'd learned as a boy. He attended every school function, sitting proudly in the back, as Florence directed her students in recitations and performances. Maggie, fully recovered by April, found work helping the dressmaker and quickly became popular among the young people of Dalhart with her cheerful nature and San Antonio fashion knowledge. She stayed with the Millers, who had grown so fond of her they treated her like a daughter. As May approached, Florence faced the decision she had postponed thinking about. The school board had already asked about her intentions for the following year. Several of the town's eligible men, including the young banker, had expressed interest in courting her, unaware that her heart was already spoken for. One warm evening, as Florence and Patrick walked along the creek that ran behind her property, he asked the question that had hovered between them for months. "Have you decided?" he asked simply, his hand warm around hers. Florence stopped, turning to face him in the golden light of sunset. "I've been offered another year at the school," she said. "With a raise," Patrick nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "It's a good position, secure." "Yes," Florence agreed, "and I've enjoyed teaching here." She took a deep breath. "But I've written to a school in Helena, Montana. They're in need of a teacher for the fall term." Hope flared in Patrick's eyes. And they've offered me the position," she said, a smile breaking across her face. "I accepted this morning." Patrick's whoop of joy startled birds from nearby trees as he lifted Florence off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her down to kiss her thoroughly. When they finally broke apart, both laughing, he cupped her face in his hands. "Marry me," he said, "before we leave for Montana. Marry me here, with the friends you've made, before we start our new life together." Florence's heart swelled with love for this man who had stumbled into her life during a blizzard and changed everything. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Patrick Callahan." They were married 2 weeks later in Dalhart's small church, with Maggie as Florence's maid of honor and Dr. Miller standing as Patrick's best man. The entire town turned out for the celebration, showering them with good wishes and practical gifts for their journey north. Sheriff Wilson presented them with an unexpected wedding gift news that Judge Harrington had been indicted on multiple charges after other young women had come forward with stories similar to Maggie's. The judge's influence had finally failed to protect him from his own misdeeds. "Seems you started something important when you stood up to him," the sheriff told Patrick, shaking his hand. "You might have saved more girls than just your sister." In early June, the newly formed Callahan family loaded their wagon and prepared to depart Dalhart. Florence had packed her precious books, her writing journals, and the quilt her mother had made. Maggie brought her new dressmaking skills and patterns, excited about the possibility of opening a shop in Helena once they were settled. Patrick led their small caravan with 4 good horses, 2 for the wagon and 2 for riding, purchased with his savings from months of work. As they paused at the edge of town for a final look back, Florence felt a momentary pang at leaving her first Western home. But when she glanced at Patrick beside her, his face alight with love and anticipation of their future, she knew she had made the right choice. "Having second thoughts, Mrs. Callahan?" he asked softly. Noticing her wistful expression, Florence smiled, leaning against his strong shoulder. "Not a single one, Mr. Callahan." "Good," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Because Montana awaits, and so does the rest of our lives together." With that, they turned their faces northward, toward mountains and valleys they had yet to see, and the home they would build together, all because a desperate man had stolen firewood from a kind woman's shed during a Texas blizzard. Their journey to Montana took nearly 2 months, filled with challenges and adventures. They crossed rivers swollen with spring rains, navigated mountain passes still dotted with snow, and weathered storms that tested the durability of their wagon. But they also witnessed breathtaking beauty, endless prairies carpeted with wildflowers, dramatic canyons carved by ancient waters, and star-filled skies that seemed close enough to touch. At night, gathered around their campfire, Florence would sometimes write in her journal, capturing the day's events and the landscape's majesty. Patrick would watch her with quiet admiration, occasionally suggesting details she might have missed. Maggie often entertained them with songs she had learned in San Antonio, her clear voice rising into the vast western sky. They arrived in Helena in late July, dusty and weary, but filled with anticipation. The town was larger than Dalhart, bustling with activity from the nearby mining operations and growing cattle industry. They found a small house to rent on the outskirts, with enough land for Patrick to keep their horses and eventually expand into the ranching operation he dreamed of. Florence began teaching at the local school in September, quickly earning the respect of her students and their parents with her dedication and innovative teaching methods. Patrick found work with a cattle operation, his skill with horses making him particularly valuable during roundups. Maggie, true to her ambitions, secured an apprenticeship with Helena's most prominent dressmaker, her San Antonio experience proving invaluable. Their first winter in Montana tested them again, harsher and longer than Texas winters, with snow that piled higher than their cabin's windows and temperatures that froze breath in midair. But this time, they had prepared well. Their woodshed was stacked to the rafters, their pantry well stocked, and most importantly, they had each other. On the coldest nights, as they huddled near their hearth, Patrick would often remind Florence of their beginning. "Remember when Maggie stole your firewood?" he would ask, his arms wrapped around her as they watched the flames dance. "Best theft of my life," Florence would laugh and nestle closer to him. "I thought I was going to freeze to death alone in that cabin. Instead, I found my family." By their second year in Montana, Patrick had saved enough to purchase a small ranch of his own, just 50 acres, but with good water and grazing land. They built a sturdy house with enough room for their growing family, as Florence was expecting their first child by then. Frederick Patrick Callahan was born in the spring of 1882. A healthy, robust boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's thoughtful eyes. Maggie, who had moved into her own small house in town but visited frequently, was named godmother and doted on her nephew shamelessly. As the years passed, the Callahan Ranch prospered and expanded. Patrick's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread throughout the territory, bringing buyers from as far away as Oregon and Colorado. Florence continued teaching until their second child, Elizabeth Margaret, was born in 1884, after which she devoted herself to raising their children and writing the stories she had always dreamed of creating. To her surprise and delight, her stories found an audience. A collection of her frontier tales was published by a Boston publishing house in 1888, followed by a novel inspired by their own love story in 1890. Critics praised her authentic portrayal of Western life and the depth of her characters. Maggie never married, preferring independence to the constraints of matrimony. Her dressmaking establishment became the most sought after in Helena, catering to the wives of wealthy mine owners and ranchers. She remained a beloved part of the Callahan family, spending every holiday and special occasion at the ranch, teaching her niece and nephew to sew and appreciate fine craftsmanship. In 1899, 20 years after that fateful blizzard in Dalhart, Patrick and Florence sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching their grown children and 3 grandchildren playing in the summer twilight. Their youngest, James Thomas, born in 1886, was showing his nephew how to throw a lasso, while Frederick discussed cattle prices with a neighboring rancher who had come to dinner. "Did you ever imagine this?" Florence asked, her hand resting comfortably in Patrick's. Time had silvered his temples and etched lines around his eyes, but he was still as handsome to her as he had been that first day, standing tall and protective beside their makeshift tent. "Not in my wildest dreams," Patrick admitted, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. "I was just trying to keep Maggie alive and get us somewhere safe. I never expected to find everything I never knew I wanted." Florence smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And it all started because you needed firewood." Patrick chuckled, the sound as warm and comforting to Florence as it had been for 2 decades. "No, my love. It started because you opened your door instead of your rifle when you found thieves on your property." "Best decision I ever made," Florence murmured. As night fell across the Montana ranch, stars emerging like scattered diamonds above the mountains, Florence Callahan reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here from a desperate act of theft during a Texas blizzard to a life richer and more fulfilling than either of them could have imagined. Some might call it luck or fate or divine providence, but Florence knew the truth. Their story had begun with compassion in the face of need, with seeing the humanity in a stranger's desperation. And it had grown through courage, perseverance, and love, the most powerful force she had ever known. The fire burned bright in their hearth, with stacked neatly beside it more than enough to keep them warm through whatever storms might come. And beside her sat the man who had stolen her firewood all those years ago, and in return had given her a lifetime of love.